The men defending Ortona had never retreated. They were the German 1st Parachute Division, the Fallschirmjäger, Hitler's most decorated and most feared soldiers in Italy. They had stopped every Allied advance. They had earned that reputation across North Africa, across Sicily, and up the length of the Italian peninsula. In December 1943, they were ordered to hold a small Adriatic port town until the last man. They had fortified every building, mined every street, and prepared to destroy whoever came through the gate. What came through the gate was the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. What happened next forced them to coin a name they had never used before. By the autumn of 1943, the Italian campaign had already shattered the comfortable Allied assumption that the road to Rome would be short. The invasion of Sicily in July had proceeded with relative speed, and when the Allies crossed the Strait of Messina in September, there was a prevailing sense among some commanders that Italian resistance would crumble quickly. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in the Mediterranean theater, had other intentions entirely. Kesselring ordered the construction of a fortified defensive system stretching across the narrowest part of the Italian peninsula. This became the Gustav Line, a chain of interlocking positions, river crossings, and mountain strongpoints running from Monte Cassino in the west to the Adriatic coast in the east. The eastern anchor of that line was Ortona, a small seaport of roughly 10,000 residents sitting on a steep plateau above the Adriatic Sea. In Kesselring's strategic calculus, it was irreplaceable. If Ortona fell, Allied forces could advance north to Pescara and access mountain passes that gave a direct approach to Rome from the northeast. That could not be permitted. Defending Ortona was the 1st Parachute Division under General der Fallschirmtruppe Richard Heydrich, described by General Harold Alexander as the best German troops in Italy. His paratroopers had prepared the town systematically beginning on December 12th. They destroyed buildings at key intersections so that rubble piles 10 to 15 feet high blocked every secondary street, then seeded those piles with mines and booby traps. Doors, windows, and furniture inside homes were wired to explosive devices. One main route, Highway 16, was left conspicuously clear. It was a calculated invitation. Sherman tanks advancing down the only navigable road would enter a prepared killing ground, flanked on all sides by concealed machine guns and anti-tank positions, firing from the upper floors of fortified buildings. The Allied command had not anticipated this level of resistance. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army, believed the Germans would withdraw north of the town to take advantage of terrain more favorable to defense. The port would fall. It was expected to be straightforward. The formation tasked with taking it was Major General Christopher Vokes's 1st Canadian Infantry Division. These were men who had already crossed the Moro River in early December under fire, who had fought through waterlogged fields in what would prove to be the wettest December on record. The Moro had risen more than 8 feet above normal levels. The ground beyond it was a sea of mud that clung to boots and equipment and ground men's endurance down to its foundations. Before reaching Ortona, the Canadians had already spent weeks fighting through a series of entrenched German positions, the Gully, Cider Crossroads, Casa Berardi. Each had extracted a significant toll. The Royal 22nd Regiment, the Van Doos, had broken the German line at the gully through a flanking maneuver conducted under sustained fire. The West Nova Scotia Regiment had lost 18 officers alone in that approach, including their commanding officer. By the time Brigadier Bertram Hoffmeister's 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade closed on the outskirts of Ortona on December 20th, the men who would fight for the town had already been in continuous combat for weeks. Nobody in the Allied command had prepared them for what the town itself would demand. The initial assault committed the loyal Edmonton Regiment as the primary attacking force, supported by C Squadron of the 12th Canadian Armored Regiment, better known as the Three Rivers Regiment, and the Royal Canadian Engineers 4th Field Company. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada were ordered to protect the eastern flank and clear the southeastern portion of the town, including the area around the Church of Santa Maria de Costantinopoli, which they secured after sharp fighting before the battle had fully entered its most brutal phase. From the morning of December 21st, the pattern that would define the next 7 days became clear almost immediately. Highway 16, the only street wide enough for armored support, led directly into Piazza della Vittoria, a large open square surrounded on all sides by buildings the Germans had transformed into interlocking fortresses. Rubble piles at the northern end of the road had been mined with surface-laid charges. The loyal Eddies and their supporting engineers discovered almost at once that the conventional approach to urban combat, entering a building at street level, clearing every floor upward, then re-entering the street to access the next structure, was functionally suicidal in Ortona. Returning to the street meant exposure. The streets themselves had been designed to kill. What emerged in the first 2 days of fighting was not a technique drawn from any training manual. It was born out of necessity, adapted under fire, and refined after each casualty. The Canadians began using beehive-shaped charges, demolition devices that produced a focused explosive force, to blast holes through interior walls on upper floors, ideally from the top floor of a secured building into the adjacent structure. Once the breach was opened, soldiers passed through into the next building from above, entering 3 floors up rather than from the street, and cleared downward floor by floor with grenades thrown ahead of them as they descended. The tactic became known as mouse-holing. It neutralized the single greatest German advantage, the ability to fire down on attackers entering from ground level. A soldier entering through a wall 3 floors up was attacking from an unexpected position at close range in near darkness, with the element of disorientation working in his favor. The Germans had spent weeks preparing Ortona to stop a conventional infantry advance. They had not prepared it to stop this. The fighting moved in increments measured in rooms rather than in meters. Progress on some days amounted to the width of a single house. The Three Rivers Regiment's tanks were essential in blasting through reinforced rubble piles and suppressing German positions in the upper floors of buildings before infantry breached the walls. The Royal Canadian Artillery's 90th Anti-Tank Battery deployed both 6-pounder and 17-pounder guns in direct fire support at ranges that made the work extraordinarily dangerous for the crews. On December 22nd, Major James Stone of the Loyal Eddies made a calculated decision to conduct a penetration directly up Highway 16 without clearing every building en route, an aggressive gamble that gained ground initially before being stopped by a mined rubble pile at Piazza Municipale. The Germans responded to every Canadian advance by attempting to collapse buildings on top of the soldiers inside them. The Canadians returned the method. On one occasion, the loyal Eddies wired a German-occupied building and detonated it, killing the 2 platoons defending it. In an earlier incident, a German mine detonated inside a building and destroyed an entire platoon of the loyal Edmonton Regiment, leaving a single survivor who was pulled alive from the rubble 80 hours later. The cold compounded every tactical difficulty. December 1943 was Italy's wettest month on record, and the temperature at night fell enough to affect both weapons and men. The oil and rifle mechanisms thickened in the cold and required constant attention to keep cycling reliably. Mortar base plate settings shifted as ground temperature changed. Wool battle dress absorbed water and lost its insulating properties when soaked, which happened continuously. Canvas webbing became stiff and difficult to work in low temperatures. For soldiers spending days inside rubble-filled buildings, alternating between frantic close-quarters action and enforced stillness in stone interiors where no heating existed, the physical toll of the cold was cumulative in ways that did not always appear in casualty reports. Battle exhaustion cases were significant. Over the course of December, nearly 4,800 members of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division were evacuated as casualties, wounded, or as a result of battle exhaustion and illness, a figure that included men lost in the fighting before Ortona as well as within it. The Seaforth Highlanders under Lieutenant Colonel Sid Thompson were committed to the central axis of advance by December 22nd and fought alongside the loyal Eddies through successive piazzas and building complexes, adapting the mouse-holing technique with each engagement. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry joined the battle in the final days. Together, these 3 regiments constituted the fighting corps of 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade's assault on Ortona. Together, they were grinding one of Germany's finest divisions into an exhausted, depleted rearguard that could no longer hold what it had been ordered to defend at all costs. The civilian population of Ortona had not evacuated. Approximately 10,000 people had lived in the town before the war, and a significant number remained through the December fighting, sheltering in basements and cellars as the battle moved room by room through the buildings above them. Canadian war artist Charles Comfort, who was present during the fighting, described the civilian experience as inseparable from the military one. A population that had survived German occupation and found itself now at the center of a battle its town was never designed to endure. Canadian war correspondent Christopher Buckley, who was in the town during the battle, recorded one such encounter. Children who had been sheltering in a basement emerged when soldiers entered their building, pressing close to the men and flinching at the sound of nearby anti-tank guns. The soldiers held them. An elderly woman distributed glasses of marsala. Outside, the fighting continued. These moments did not slow the battle. They existed within it. Brief interruptions in the cycle of room clearing and wall breaching, points at which the human reality of what the war had done to this town became impossible to ignore. The Canadians who fought in Ortona were mostly volunteers in their 20s. Many had not been outside Canada before the war. The Italy they were fighting through was not the Italy they had imagined. Not olive groves and warm light, but rubble fields in a cold December rain and people who had been waiting in cellars for someone to come. Christmas Day, 1943, fell on the 5th day of the battle. Fighting had not stopped. German positions in the northern part of the town still held. Mortar rounds still fell. Captain D.B. Cameron, the Seaforth Highlanders quartermaster, made a decision that had no tactical justification and required considerable ingenuity to execute. He organized a Christmas dinner inside the battered church of Santa Maria de Costantinopoli, a few blocks from the front line. The church had been cleared and was serving as the Seaforth's battalion headquarters. Cameron's men gathered tablecloths, chinaware, roast pork, cauliflower, mashed potatoes, applesauce, Christmas pudding, fruit, nuts, chocolate, cigarettes, and 2 pints of beer for each man. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson ordered the companies to eat in rotations. Each group came off the line, sat down at a table laid with actual silverware, ate a Christmas meal while an officer played the church organ, then returned to the front to relieve the next company. From 11 o'clock in the morning until 1900 hours, the dinner continued in shifts. The Seaforth's war diary, written by an officer who was present, recorded the scene with a precision that has not faded with time. As each exhausted, unshaven man entered the church and saw the set tables, the expression on his face was described as a reward those responsible would never forget. An improvised choir organized by the regiment's padre sang carols. For a short period, in a bombed-out church in a town that was still being fought over, there was, in the war diary's own phrasing, a true Christmas spirit. Not every man made it back. When D Company's Lieutenant Dave Fairweather led his platoon out from the last dinner rotation at 1900 hours, a German shell landed among his troops. Private Ernest Smoky Smith of New Westminster, British Columbia, had refused to attend the dinner at all, telling his section that men would be killed going to it and coming back. He was right. He would later receive the Victoria Cross for his actions in Italy. The dinner had given what it could give. The battle had not paused to honor the occasion. By first light on December 28th, the German 1st Parachute Division withdrew under cover of darkness. They did not surrender. They pulled back intact as a formation to defensive positions north of the town. Ortona was in Canadian hands. The month of December 1943 had cost the 1st Canadian Infantry Division 2,339 casualties, a figure that included 484 dead. The losses suffered in that single month represented nearly 1/4 of all Canadian casualties in the entire Italian campaign. General Montgomery, commanding the 8th Army, issued his assessment in terms his headquarters rarely used for formations it had previously underestimated. The Canadians were, in his words, quite magnificent, and in the end had outfought the Germans. The praise was notable partly because of its source. Montgomery was not given to extravagant recognition. The volunteers his headquarters had been handed, largely inexperienced in sustained urban combat, fighting in conditions no training exercise had replicated, had outperformed the standard his headquarters had expected. Major General Vokes, who had commanded the 1st Canadian Infantry Division through the entire month of bloody December, offered an assessment that was less formal, but perhaps more accurate. Everything before Ortona, he said, was a nursery tale. The name the Germans gave the Canadians during those 8 days, Kleine Teufel, Little Devils, was not spoken with contempt. It was spoken with the recognition that these men did not fight the way the Fallschirmjäger had expected. They improvised under fire. They punched through walls instead of walking into prepared killing grounds. They held their formations under conditions that had exhausted or shattered other Allied units. They came back every morning, and on Christmas Day, in a damaged church a few blocks from active combat, they sat down at tables with white tablecloths and ate Christmas dinner in rotations before returning to the line. The two qualities, the tactical ferocity and the instinct to maintain dignity in the worst circumstances, were not in contradiction. They were part of the same formation. 82 years after December 1943, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada still hold their annual Ortona dinner every December. The menu is nearly identical to the one Captain Cameron assembled in the ruins of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli. The tradition has been maintained without interruption since the war. It is not a celebration. It is a reckoning with what those men went through, and a recognition that what they did in that town, both the fighting and the sitting down to eat together, was worth remembering. The world had looked east in December 1943 toward the larger battles on the Eastern Front. Ortona had not been part of the headlines that week. For Canadian families, it remains part of the memory that does not require headlines.